There we go. And then I'll hit record here. Well, welcome back, listeners. This is the BCB podcast. I'm Aaron Washington, your host, back to discuss some basketball here with you guys today. We're getting closer to the restart of the NBA season. As we know, we're just a couple weeks out, and today, as of this recording, it's actually July 7th, and this is the day that many teams are going to make their way to Orlando for the restart. They're getting going, and the Orlando Magic are actually already arrived. They were just a short bus ride away, so luckily for them, things were pretty easy as far as travel accommodations, but I'm really glad and really excited to have Ian Levy here on the podcast today, guys. He is the Creative Editorial Director for Fansided, the Step Back Nylon Calculus. Really good resources for basketball fans out there. So I've been reading his work for a little while now. Really glad to have him on. He has a lot of insights, a lot of great information about the NBA to share with you guys today. So Ian, thank you for taking your time to join us. And I'm really excited to see what you have to say about some of the topics we'll discuss here today.
Thanks a lot for having me on. I'm excited.
Yes, sir. Anytime. So our first topic of today out of two is going to be the second part of a series that I've been doing here. This is the second week, and this is going over the top guards, the top players that are coming up on free agency this fall for 2020. Last week I discussed the point guards. If you guys haven't seen that podcast or listened to it before, go ahead and check that out. But this week is going to be the shooting guards. So we're getting into the second part of the backcourt here, looking at some players that are going to be highly desirable on the open market once we get through this restarted season. So, of course, free agency is going to be a little bit different this year. It's going to be in the fall. It's going to be right after the conclusion of the season. So there's going to be less time for teams to kind of get ready for that and prepare. So they're going to kind of be splitting their responsibilities here between looking at the playoffs for those teams that will be in Orlando and looking at free agency. So to get started here, Ian, I figured out we can look at some of the top options here. Of course, this is subjective. If anybody else comes to mind for you during this exercise, don't be afraid to shout them out or just kind of mention them as we go along. But the first player I had here on this list that I wanted to look at a little bit, it's a very interesting case because he is a restricted free agent, and that is going to be Bogdanovic. I like to call him BB8. He's one of the better shooters in our league here, and he's done some really good things for Sacramento during his time in the league. His case is a little bit more interesting because he's an older player here. He's already almost 28 years old, believe it or not. He came over a little bit later compared to some other players. So the thing about him we have to understand is he's a great shooter, and shooters in today's league are highly prioritized and valued. So that's definitely going to help him when he's trying to get a new contract. But of course, Sacramento already has some money tied up in some other players, or at least coming up. Marvin Bagley, De'Aaron Fox, a lot of different young players that will be coming out free agency. Buddy Hield just got paid, so we had to consider that as well. So for Bogdanovic, what are some initial thoughts that come to mind for you when you're thinking of free agency? Do you see the Kings matching any offers for him? And if not, where do you think he might end up as we get into the free agency period?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that the Kings would really like to keep him. It's going to be tight financially, and it's going to come down to what that offer sheet looks like, and what they're able to squeeze out. Maybe they're making a trade somewhere else to clear some space before they have to make that decision. But I think he's a really appealing player. Maybe doesn't have as much upside because of his age, but you know what you're getting, and he's already demonstrated, some really reliable NBA skills. He's a good shooter. He's a good shooter off the dribble. He can function as a secondary creator. And I think not an exceptional defender, but he can hold up at that end a little bit. And so I think, the situation that he's in with the Kings, is probably kind of the ideal role for him. He can play on or off the ball. And he's primarily a bench player, but he's coming in and playing big minutes. He can fit with a variety of different kinds of backcourt players. He can handle a little bit more if he's playing with more shooters. He can be more of a spot up or a floor spacer threat if he's playing with people who need to have the ball in their hands. So I think he makes a lot of sense for the Kings. I think they'll really want to keep him, but he'll get plenty of attention elsewhere too.
Definitely. Those were my thoughts exactly when thinking about when he's going to offer to the Kings or some other team. And just looking at his numbers, I mean, he definitely fits the mold of a traditional shooter. I mean, he puts up 7.2 threes a game, so he's definitely a high volume shooter. And he definitely offers an element of accuracy as well at 36%. So definitely someone that you can rely on to space the floor. And he offers a lot of value for a team like Sacramento because you have someone like De'Aaron Fox that thrives in the open court and the space and pace kind of offense. And unfortunately for Sacramento, they didn't really have that this year to that extent. When Luke Walton came in, things were a little bit different for him. But for a guy like De'Aaron Fox, he needs that kind of space. He needs that kind of, just the opportunity to operate in the open floor, space for him to kind of create for others. And Bogdanovich has definitely been a beneficiary of that and will continue to be one as we go forward. And when it comes to what kind of money he'll get, I had to think about this a little bit because, of course, like you said, he is an older player, so that would influence teams' decision making a little bit. But if you put him under a 2 or 3 year contract, that still puts him at around age 30. So you're not looking at a guy that's going to be completely tapped out. Not somebody that's going to rely on a ton of athleticism to get his looks. So that's definitely a benefit for him as well. But I'm thinking that a 3 year deal would be safe for a team to give him. Unless he wanted to try to hit free agency a little bit earlier. And then, of course, shooters can make a good bit of money in this environment, but I'm not sure that, things would be exactly the same for him. His situation is a little bit unique. What are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what a dollar figure would look like. I think, there's potential for this free agency to be especially screwy. Just coming off this weird year, player evaluation is going to be strange. Teams know the cap is going to shrink slightly with the losses this year, but who knows if the pandemic is sort of going on, still as we get into the fall, if it looks like, there's going to still be economic troubles, and next season there might be another financial hit for the league and the cap tightening. So, he's probably, that contract value is going to be a little bit smaller than it would have been before the season started. But, I would guess somebody's going to offer him, $10 million a year at least.
That's what I was thinking. And I kind of mentioned this last week in my podcast. We're going over the point guards. This environment is definitely especially difficult to navigate just because we don't know what the cap figure is going to look like for next year. We don't know how the league is going to approach doing that. If the smoothing is going to be something they do or they go another route. So there's a lot of variables that we just haven't seen in years past that we have to consider when looking at these values. So of course, everything that we put up is definitely subject to change based on the ever-changing environment of the league. And just looking at their cap sheet, I mean, things definitely going to get interesting going forward. I mean, they already have a team salary projected for next year of that's 162 million considering their cap holds, but definitely not going to be that high because Ken Bazemore comes off the Bucks. Not sure what his contract would look like. Alex Len going to be another free agent. A guy like Harry Giles, who I think they renounced the rights to. So a lot of moving pieces on this roster, but if they retain him, it's going to be interesting because they have an interesting positional logjam there. Buddy Hield, of course, came off the bench as we got later in this season, which he didn't enjoy. But Bogdanovich actually did some good things for them while he was a starter. So I'm not sure how they're going to navigate that. If you give him a certain amount of money, he's going to be expecting a lot of minutes. Do you think long term that they can actually function with a backcourt of Fox, Hield, Bogdanovich? Are they going to have to subject one of those guys to the bench full time? What do you think is the best way to handle that situation?
I think ideally you want Fox and Hield and Bogdanovich off the bench. I think that's the best role. Bogdanovich can play with Hield, he can play with Fox, and he can play some three, if he has to. I don't think you want him at the three full time. Especially defensively, if Hield is if Hield's the other wing, that's kind of a rough defensive combination to have out there together. But I think they can absolutely work as a trio. Somebody's ego is gonna have to take a hit between him and Hield to go to the bench. But I think sort of as a threesome on paper, I think it really works.
Me too. Those are my thoughts exactly. And while we're going along the theme of shooters here, I mean, there's someone else we have to consider, somebody that's made a really nice name for himself ever since he was a part of a trade a few years ago. This is going to be Joe Harris. So this is another kind of shooter. He's in a similar mold of a Bogdanovich, does a lot of the same things for Brooklyn. He did wonders for D'Angelo Russell as he was going forward into his career. He got a really good deal of his own last year. So this is somebody that operates in the same, pretty much the same role. It doesn't take quite as many threes a game, but it's still high volume. I mean, we're looking at 6 threes a game for Joe Harris, 41% shooter. He actually shot 47% last season on very good volume. So Joe Harris is another player that's going to garner some interest just because he can space the floor, and he's a great fit with a lot of different teams out there. So for Joe Harris, I mean, his situation is a little bit different. Brooklyn already has their foundation, they have their core. They have Durant, they have Kyrie. They're ready to make a push for a championship next season, assuming those guys are healthy. But for Joe Harris, looking at this from their team's perspective, it might be worth keeping him around as maybe a trade piece. You're looking at maybe bringing in a third star to go next to Kyrie and KD. That's something that I think they will heavily consider. It might be one reason why they bring him back, even though that they have a lot of money tied up already. It just could be beneficial for the long-term outlook. So for Joe Harris, I think he can garner another maybe 2-year deal like he got 2 years ago, maybe similar value. Of course, it definitely has gone up in past years because of his performance, but I think that's somebody else that's definitely going to garner a lot of attention for the same reasons that Bogdanovich did or will do in this free agency.
Yeah, I think Harris has some leverage with the Nets. I think, like you said, he's useful for them as a trade chip. He's really useful, as a floor spacer and a shooter around Kyrie and Durant. He's pretty limited outside of shooting, but he's a very good shooter off movement. His numbers were down a little bit this year, but last year he was one of the best in the league shooting coming off screens. So he's certainly a piece that they could really use and get a lot of value out of it. Some of it may come down to kind of what his experience was being around Kyrie this year, and how optimistic he feels about the Nets' chances. But maybe he's a guy who takes a little bit less per year and gets an extra year tacked onto that contract, so that he can stay in Brooklyn and kind of be a part of this championship contender. But, he's also a guy who will get offers from other teams. Like I said, his skill set's a little bit limited, but he's really, really good at what he does. He's the kind of player every contender, would love to have on the roster.
Oh, yeah. For Joe Harris, I mean, another consideration for him is, like you said, just the nature of that roster. I mean, everybody competes to win a championship, and unless it's just some outrageous amount of money from another team, I mean, I can see him sticking around. I'm sure he would want a nice little pay raise. Only made $7.6 million this season. So a little bit of a raise over that would be nice for him. But even if it's the same value, even if it's just kind of like something similar just to kind of keep him around, I think he would definitely strongly consider that. And it would be nice for the Nets to be able to get some kind of discount on him, since they're already looking at a ton of money being devoted to him. And, they're definitely going to be paying the tax, because of those huge contracts. KD and Kyrie at 40 and 33 million. Karis LeVert at 16 million. Got to think about that as well. So a lot of big contracts on their books. But for Joe Harris, I think it'd be worth the investment, at least up to a certain point, just because of what he offers that team. And you mentioned earlier that, his shooting is his primary skill, and that's what he's relying on to do on the court. Absolutely true. But I think it's worth noting as well that, he's not a bad shooter from the inside. His volume probably isn't what it is. He doesn't do it that much, but inside the court, inside the arc, I mean, he's still looking at, above 50% shooter from 2-point range. This season, he was at about 53.6. So for Joe Harris, I think he's improved his game a little bit when it comes to attacking off the catch, because a lot of times the defense is going to be scrambled a little bit. He's going to find some openings to get inside. So I think that's something that teams will consider as well, just looking at what he can do from not just the 3, but from the 2, at least in certain situations. I wouldn't call him a creator necessarily, but he's a good finisher in his own right. And I think he's going to be a really good player no matter who he suits up for, just because of the variety of different skills that he can offer to a team.
Yeah, absolutely. There's going to be quite a bit of suitors for him, and it would be interesting to see him stay in Brooklyn, because I think I don't think that the fit with Durant and Irving is going to be quite as seamless as everybody assumes. I think it's not just about star power, and they still have some tweaking to do on that roster to fill it out before they're really a contender, I think.
True. I'm just really impressed by what he's done with his career since he came from Cleveland. He was a throw-in in a trade. People didn't really expect much from him, but just another testament to Brooklyn's kind of developmental culture. Just getting a guy like that to come in and really just buy in completely to what Coach Atkinson at the time was offering for his team. He's just one of many players that has found a great place for himself, and I think he's going to think about that as well. It should give Brooklyn a leg up just because of what they've done for his career and what they should be able to do going forward since they're going to be a title contender. So we're sticking with the shooting guards here, Ian, and we have another player on this list. So we've gone over two guys a little bit older, second half of their careers. They're 27, 28 years old, 30 is around the corner. But for this third player, he's looking at a career that's just getting started. He just got an opportunity to kind of come in and do more because, many of us knew that he was capable of more than he got to show. So Malik Beasley is another name here that I'm very excited to talk about. Just because that in the limited sample that we got from him in Minnesota, he did some great things for that team. Looks to be a good fit next to like D'Angelo Russell, a Towns, and they're literally looking for some young players to kind of come and supplement them. They've had some draft kind of mishaps in the past, and they need some role players, some high-level role players to go next to those guys. So for Malik Beasley, initial impressions from him, I was impressed for what he offered to that team and just a small sample size. But I think moving from Denver was the best thing for his career because with Will Barton and Jamal Murray and those other guys over there, he didn't get really a chance to flourish. So I think Minnesota's going to do wonders for him, and he's definitely going to make himself a little bit of money over there with the display he put on just a few months ago.
Yeah, I think for me, some of the shine came off him last year. He really struggled in Denver before the trade. The year before that, he really looked like an up and comer and potentially a huge piece for Denver. He was so important for them off the bench. And in a rough situation, yeah, he struggled a little bit last year before the trade. I honestly worry about him a little bit in Minnesota. They have, he's a guy who has some two-way potential. He played some good defense in Denver, not always consistently, but he has some defensive upside. And the defensive situation in Minnesota, I think, is going to be just so bad with Towns in the middle and D'Angelo Russell. I feel like it's not going to necessarily be a situation that's conducive to sort of pulling out the best in him on the defensive end. Fun and exciting team fits there. He's young. He's going to play up tempo. More shooting help. Can operate as a slasher and a secondary creator, but and I can certainly see why he would want to stay there and sort of be a part of that young core and keep building with them. But I don't know. It strikes me as a situation that maybe gives him a little too much offensive freedom and doesn't ask or doesn't give him quite enough support defensively to really be successful and maximize his potential at that end.
I can see that. Minnesota is definitely a place where, the opportunity is going to be here for him, all the minutes he can ever want. He went from averaging 17 minutes a game in Denver in those 40 games for them to 32, almost 33 minutes a game for Minnesota in just 14 games. So definitely a huge spike in usage for him, a lot more opportunities. But yeah, like you said, they have some challenges to try to figure out. It definitely hurts when your two cornerstones of your franchise are not strong defensive players. A lot of people say defense wins championships, and I think that's somewhat true. You have to be at least a competent defensive team to really have a chance to make a run. And I can definitely see them making the playoffs just because of all that firepower they have. Towns being the borderline superstar that he is, but definitely they have their challenges. And for Malik, I think I don't think he's thinking about that right now. I think he's considering the fact that he's going to have opportunities and he just wants to make the playoffs. And I think that's going to be there for them sometime in the near future. But yeah, there's definitely some things to consider when it comes to just the different pieces on that team. And, I'm definitely in agreement with you. Looking at the on-off numbers here for that team, and I think just the defensive, just how putrid they are skews his numbers. Clean the Glass says that when he's on the court for Minnesota, they were allowing 4.8 points more per 100 possessions. And, I don't think that's fair to him because I think he is a solid defender. I think we're in agreement on that. But it does definitely say that, he's a positive on offense, adds 3.6 points per 100 possessions on that end of the court. And I think that's also skewed by their offensive proficiency. So definitely a team that skews in one direction over the other. The numbers bear that out. But going forward, I am interested to see what else he can offer this team. Just having an opportunity now, coming up in the prime of his career, 23 years old. By next season, he should be about 24. So, I mean, all the opportunities there for him to just kind of go off and just have a career year. So, with all that being considered, I mean, I'm interested to see what suitors will potentially offer him. The potential is there, but in this market, I don't know if unless you're a star player, that's going to do enough for you to kind of get you over that hump and offer you a lot of money. So, I could see him getting 3 or 4 years, but I'm not sure about long-term money just because of the environment. And then he hasn't had a ton of opportunities to prove himself. He just got that in the last year or two. So it's going to be a little more sketchy for him, I think, than the other two players we mentioned previously.
Yeah, and they'll also have some choices too. I mean, Jarrod Culver is a wing, not a great shooter, but has some defensive upside, and theoretically as a secondary creator. And if they find themselves at the top of the draft this year, they may be looking at somebody like Killian Hayes or LaMelo Ball or Anthony Edwards. They're taking one of those guys as the best player available. That's another guard, who maybe pushes Beasley out too.
True. I mean, they have some other pieces to consider, but at least they have somebody that they really believe and it's proven that can actually be a solid player for them. Jarrod Culver is just kind of like, he's worth giving him some more looks to, of course. I mean, he only had one season under his belt, but there's definitely a lot he needs to work on. I think he's far from a finished product, definitely very raw. But Malik, definitely a little more proven and a better fit as a starter, at least at this point in time. So excited to see what kind of offers he gets and what teams are going to actually value him at just because of that changing environment over there. So one more name here for the shooting guards before we move on to the next portion here. KCP. So this is more of a veteran player. He has a lot to prove and a lot can happen down in the restart here going into Orlando. So I'm kind of scared for the Lakers because they're really going to be counting on him to do a lot for them in the absence of Avery Bradley. I don't know if I'd feel comfortable about giving that kind of responsibility and leaning that much to a guy like KCP. In his career so far, he's proven to be a pretty up and down player. This season was no exception. I'm sure you remember at the beginning of the season, Lakers fans were just absolutely just restless. I mean, I think he just kept missing his threes. He couldn't get on board. People were calling him out, saying he shouldn't play and being benched and all this stuff. And then the second half of the season, I mean, he just kind of took off, just became that player that many people expected him to be in LA. But at least he has decent size, decent defender, definitely a better option than a lot of the other guys on the roster. Caruso is a good player as well, but I think KCP is a little more proven, a larger sample to draw from. So interested to see how his performance in Orlando will affect his evaluation, because I think he can go a lot of different ways. He can be a great performer for them, or he can just kind of fall back into that slump for him. So a lot of different variables. And unfortunately for the Lakers, that's their whole backcourt. Deion Raiders, J.R. Smith, they're all kind of the same player, up and down microwave type players. So I can see this going a lot of different directions for KCP and the Lakers once the season is concluded.
Yeah, I mean, he feels like a pretty replaceable player to me. I don't think his overall value is that high. He shot great this year, but a lot of players have career 3-point shooting seasons when they're playing with, when they're playing next to LeBron James. He's in theory, he's a strong defender, but I think that comes and goes. And the fact that he's a little bit smaller for a wing, he's more of a 1-2 than a 2-3. That limits his value a little bit more on the defensive end. I think the Lakers wouldn't mind keeping him. I would say he's much more reliable than Avery Bradley or J.R. Smith. But I also think he's replaceable, and I don't think they're going to break the bank for him. I think there are other players out there in that mold who can fill the same role and do the same thing for the Lakers. And so if the price tag gets too high, they'll walk.
Oh yeah. And, for feel that it's important to consider too that he has a player option. So this is of course in the event that he declines that player option. But I can see him picking that up just because of, it's a team with LeBron James and Anthony Davis, and you're going to have opportunities to get plenty of open shots and just operate on a team that's guaranteed to win 50 games. Shot at 60 as long as LeBron is in his career condition, and you have Davis and then the role players around them. So I think all that is important to consider as well. The cap sheet is really irrelevant at this point. I mean, if they can find somebody that fits well LeBron, they're going to pay what they can. Use their mid-level, use whatever they can for a player. So for KCP, I think he sticks around one more season, but just wanted to throw him out there just in case he decided to turn that down for whatever reason, because you never know in this environment. Guys can decide to text the open market and just see what's out there. If you had to put a prediction out there, do you see KCP hitting that open market at all, or is he just a lock-in for another season?
I have a hard time with those kind of decisions. Like, so what is his salary? Is like $8 million for next year. That's the option. My guess is he's not going to get quite that much on his next deal, but maybe he gets a little bit more security over a longer number of years if he opts out. Who knows what happens if he's waits to hit free agency for another year. But also the Lakers are a pretty ideal situation for him. Playing next to LeBron, it helps you as a shooter. Playing, with Anthony Davis helps you as a defender. You get to be competitive and try and compete for a ring. So, I guess, probably I would assume he's going to pick up that option. Me too, definitely. Just because of that culture. I mean, nothing replaces being on a title contender like that, having a solid chance at a ring every year. So I wouldn't blame him at all. So for the second part of this conversation, let's move on to this, these schedules and look at how things are going to turn out for these teams that are going to Orlando. Jacob Goldstein has a really great system of measuring difficulty of schedule. He posted on Twitter, I think a week or two ago. So I wanted to take a look at that and at least by these numbers, look at the teams that have some of the easiest schedules as well as the toughest schedules going down into the stretch run, because this can really change the outcome of seeding. And then also at least for the Western Conference, really do go a long way towards determining who breaks into that top 8 and who's left at home. So starting with the easiest schedules here, the Pelicans are definitely a team that I want to hit on just because, Zion, number one, getting to see him back is going to be fantastic. But also that team and just what they're playing for. This is a team that I think is on the rise in the Western Conference. They're going to be a factor for years to come with that core. And I can see them making a lot of noise and making the playoffs. I think it's not a huge priority for them, but if they do, I think that would be a huge, huge confidence booster. And then, of course, for the ratings, if you have LeBron versus Zion, that's absolutely going to just explode over on the TV airways. So I'd love to see that. So I have their schedule here, remaining schedule, as well as the rating that Jacob Goldstein gave them here on Twitter. So their strength of schedule here is -0.1. So just for reference, they're the only team on this list that has a negative strength of schedule, which is actually beneficial. That's an easier schedule. And then looking at the teams they play, they're starting with Utah. I believe that's the first game of the restart on the 30th of July. Clippers, Memphis, Kings, Wizards, Spurs, Kings again, and Orlando. So just from that list, you can see that, you're playing Sacramento twice. That's a huge benefit. You're playing the Spurs without LaMarcus Aldridge. You're playing the Wizards without Bertans and now Bradley Beal, as we found out today. And then you're playing the Magic, which, a solid team, but not necessarily a world, a dominator, not a huge beast out there. So I can see initially, at least in the second half, their schedule gets pretty light. They do have to play the Clippers and Memphis early on, but things get pretty easy for them. So, I'll give them a decent chance, at least, of getting into the 8th seed. Easy schedule, young legs, a lot of talent, really good recipe for success. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they end up playing the Lakers in the first round. Yeah, I think one of the things that's going to be a little bit tricky is nobody knows exactly how every team's going to approach the restart in these 8 regular season games. There's been some talk about some of the teams sort of accepting that their playoff odds are pretty low, and mostly it's going to be, about getting some run for young players and things like that. And then the other thing that's, I think, maybe slightly misleading about the strength of schedule measurement is that some of those teams at the high end, you talk about like the Lakers. So they've got like a 5.5 game lead on the Clippers. Their chances of losing the number one seed are, slim to none. And so you could see some of those top teams not approaching these 8 regular season games with a ton of intensity. Not necessarily that they'd be resting their stars, but also not taking risks with LeBron or Anthony Davis's minutes. Same thing with the Bucks on the other side. So some of these teams that look like they have a really tough schedule by the numbers, it's not quite the same context. And some of the teams at the bottom who are trying to make the playoffs, it looks like an easier schedule if you're playing them, but they sort of actually have more on the line in these 8 games than, some of the teams at the top who maybe don't care as much about seeding or feeling secure in their seeds. So, like teams like the Kings, they might be a bit tougher in these 8 games than, somebody like the Clippers or the Lakers, who's really just, kind of trying to get their rhythm back and, maybe limiting their stars to 20 minutes a game or something like that.
I like that. That's really good analysis there, Ian. Something that I think everybody should consider before we get into the second season, so to speak, down there in Orlando. And I mean, that is definitely important to consider too. Like you said, I mean, it's going to have drastic seeding implications, and for younger teams, I mean, I can absolutely see the younger guys making a run for it. Maybe they have guys with more to prove, and then of course they're trying to make a playoff run. So that's going to change things drastically. And just like in the first part of our conversation, where we were talking about the market being volatile, all these schedules are volatile as well. There's a lot in the air. There's a lot we don't know. We don't know if guys are just going to get hurt. I mean, I was watching some overseas games recently. I was watching the basketball tournament not too long ago, and guys were going down pretty frequently with injuries just because of the quick ramp up. So, I'm scared, and I'm actually expecting a few guys to get, whether it's a hamstring strain or a calf strain or a twisted ankle, something like that, in the quick ramp up. And then also, I mean, you're looking at just the uncertainty of the COVID situation as well. So if somebody has to quarantine for a certain amount of time, they're not available. That can definitely happen as we get down the stretch run here. So, I mean, there's a lot in the air. A lot can change. So for the Pelicans, on paper, it's a great schedule, but of course, we don't know how that's all going to turn out for them. Things can change in a hurry there. But the next team on the list of easiest schedules, I think, they have a lot to play for as well. I think they're trying to play themselves back into an identity that they believe they had at the beginning of the season. So for Philadelphia, I think they benefited. They're one of the teams that benefited the most from this stoppage with Ben Simmons being hurt. Joel Embiid at many times this season just didn't seem like himself. He was kind of lackadaisical a lot of games. I think he had there was a game where he didn't score any points. I can't remember who the opponent was, but he just got blasted the next day. I think on TNT for not scoring. I think it was Toronto, actually. Yeah, Toronto didn't score. So, I mean, they have a lot to play for. A plus 0.3 strength of schedule here. They play Indiana, San Antonio. They also play Washington and Orlando, but they play Portland. They play Toronto. They play Houston. I think those teams that are right in the thick of the race for like seeds 3 through 6 or 7 in the West, I think they're all going to be playing at a high level, or at least giving a lot of effort just because of the seeding implications. And that can definitely affect what side of the bracket they end up on. So I think for them, it's going to be a little bit of a tougher road. But I can't wait to see how they come out of the gate. Because if Embiid is refocused and Ben is healthy, I think they can move their way up, especially since Indiana is not looking as strong with Oladipo being out. They can actually make a really nice run here with that schedule.
Yeah, I think they're a team that's going to they're one of the ones who's going to really try and take advantage. They're going to be trying to build a rhythm. They're going to be trying to build some momentum and try and carry it into the playoffs. They also seem like a team that's a little bit fragile to me. Back injuries, what Simmons was working on. It's the kind of thing that, could be tweaked and sort of could come up again. And, same thing with Embiid. He's been relatively healthy, but it's always sort of a question in the back of your mind. So if they're coming in and maybe not in perfect game shape and you're working up, he's a guy who seems like he maybe could be a little bit more vulnerable to tweaking something. And then, yeah, there's the question of whether, were they really the team that they looked to be this year? How much of that was issues that could be ironed out and how much of it is just structural? They are the team that they are, and, the lack of shooting and the Horford Embiid combination just doesn't work in practicality as well as it looked on paper. And so I think they're going to bring intensity, but they've got a lot to figure out.
Yeah, and then one of those things, of course, is Al Horford's place on this team. After offering all that money in last year's free agency, he just hasn't worked out for them quite as well as a lot of us had hoped, and I'm sure a lot of Sixers fans anticipated. So, for him and for that team, it can definitely go a lot of different ways just because of how much they have to prove. But like you said, they're a little more fragile. They're a little more prone to injury than maybe some other teams out there. So we're definitely going to have to just look at exactly how that schedule works out for them. It can really go in any different directions here. Another team that's in the same conference, of course, another powerhouse in the East has actually overachieved a little bit, especially compared to last season. So Boston here with a plus 1.2 strength of schedule. They're playing Milwaukee, Portland, Miami, Brooklyn, Toronto, Orlando, Memphis, and they finish with Washington. So their schedule is pretty interesting here, especially that Miami game, the Portland game, Milwaukee. That's actually one of the games I circled on the calendar here was Milwaukee on the 31st, just because that could be definitely a precursor to a playoff matchup, a significant one at that. And, Giannis back in action against Tatum and Brown. I really want to see how he navigates that team and dealing with those defenders. I mean, they seem like they have a lot of different defenders throw at Giannis, and they're uniquely positioned and situated to be able to guard that team. So that's definitely a game I can't wait for. But overall, their schedule has some, you would think on paper, some lighter games, but also some more challenging ones. So Miami will be a nice test too because they dropped some games to Miami earlier in the season, and they're definitely going to be a tougher matchup there as well with Bam. So for Boston, can't wait to see how they approach this. Hope Kemba is healthy. That's something that people have been talking about, his knee and everything. But if he is, I think they have a really good shot to possibly secure that number 2 seed. Definitely in the realm of possibility, depending on how they finish with those 8 games.
Yeah, I think I don't know how much seeding is going to be essential. Although I guess moving up from 3 to 2 could be a big deal. Could be the difference between 76ers or Pacers and getting somebody like the Nets or the Magic or the Wizards. But I think Boston is another one of those teams that has some rhythm to sort of recapture. So much shooting, so much playmaking on that team, but they've sort of got to get their on-court chemistry back. I think they'll bring the intensity in the regular season and in those 8 games and hopefully set themselves up for a deep run.
I really hope so, especially with Jason Tatum's emergence. I just got done writing a piece about him and Bam, just looking at what kind of money they might garner in an extension, which should be approaching the max, if not the max. So getting to see him back on the court is going to be fantastic, and he's going to be a big part of how deep they go. I can't wait to see how he functions in a playoff environment, even in these 8 seeding games. I want to see if that role he was on is sustainable. If he continue to be that efficient shooter, especially off the pull-up, which was much improved that he demonstrated earlier on in the season. So a lot to play for them. But to finish up this conversation, I think we need to look at also some of the tougher schedules and to see if maybe they're not quite as tough as maybe they're on paper would indicate for us. So, my team of choice, the team I root for, I'm sure, everybody that's watching this can see on the wall behind me a little bit of a fandom for the Heat here. But, Miami was pegged as having the toughest schedule. So New Orleans is at -0.1. Miami is all the way up at plus 3.7. So a huge jump from what we were looking at previously. So for their schedule, pretty interesting. Denver, Toronto, Boston, Milwaukee, Phoenix, Indiana, OKC, and then Indiana again to finish up. So the Indiana games have changed a little bit now that Oladipo won't be there, but Milwaukee, Toronto, Denver, OKC, a lot of firepower they're going to have to deal with those teams. And they're also playing for something here. Currently, I believe they have the 4th seed, so they're trying to stay out of 5th. 4th, 6th, I think that would create a tougher matchup for them being at 6 as opposed to 4 or 5. But looking at those games, there's going to be a lot to be determined playing against Boston and Milwaukee. Those are 2 teams that, they're going to be going against the Eastern Conference if they can make it, at least into the second round here, potentially. So they're not going to be able to let up at all. They got to be on their A game day in and day out, especially going against Toronto, now that they're 100% healthy. Those are challenging games. I think whether or not they're really playing at 100% or not, I think any way you slice it, that's going to be tough for them to maintain their standing. But how they've approached this time off with the virus situation, I think they're going to be in shape. I think the question for them is just going to be how much continuity and how much just function together can they recapture from earlier in the season before they went on that slump in the last 10 to 12 games before the stoppage.
Yeah, I think they're another team that'll bring intensity to the regular season. They're going to want to build momentum and heading into the playoff part. And like you said, I think they're a team that's going to be at their best. They really need chemistry and rhythm with so many ball handlers and so many shooters and, so much motion in their offense. So, yeah, it's going to be important for them to get off to a good start. And that schedule looks tough, but, who knows? It's just so hard to tell who's going to be healthy, who's going to be who's going to be playing, who's going to be resting, and who's really going to be motivated to make the most out of these games.
For sure. For them, I think they also benefit a little bit from this stoppage because looking at how they play, just people are diving on the court left and right. That's what they kind of pride themselves on, just playing hard and just being just one of those grit and grind teams. I think Jimmy Butler got worn down a little bit. Bam got worn down. A lot of minutes, a lot of responsibility, gotten beaten up a little bit. So Tyler Hero was actually hurt as well before the stoppage with an ankle injury. So them coming back healthy, I think, is going to do wonders for them. And then especially for the next team on this list, Toronto with 3.6 strength of schedule. They dealt with injuries across the entire roster. Everybody from Siakam to Marc Gasol to Kyle Lowry. Everybody was banged up at one point or another, it seems like. So for them to be able to come back in 100%, have the entire roster ready to go, I think it's going to be huge. OG Anunoby coming in, be able to make his mark after missing on that playoff run last year. I really can see them just continuing to go on that run that they were on and just making a statement, just saying that to the rest of the league. They're going to be a really tough out in the playoffs. I think even against like a Milwaukee, they're going to do some serious damage going against, in the regular season at least, the Lakers, Miami, Orlando, Boston, Memphis, Milwaukee, Philly, and then Denver. So a lot of interesting names. I'm circling rather the Lakers on the list August 1st. Siakam, LeBron, Davis. I can't wait to see how those particular matchups occur on the court. And then I want to see how both teams approach this stoppage, because with Toronto being a little bit higher up in the standings, they've been in the number 2 seed for a minute now. And then the Lakers, as far up as they've been, touched on this earlier, I want to see how they approach that game. They come out with something to prove, or, their higher standing give them a little more leeway to kind of sit back and maybe not necessarily going cruise control, but think things a little bit slower than maybe some teams that are just clawing to get back in the playoffs here.
Yeah, it's also interesting. They were the team that headed down there first, and so they've sort of been at Orlando and hopefully getting acclimated for at least a week now. Be interesting to see if that gives them any edge. But yeah, I think they think of themselves as the defending champions. Even if maybe the rest of the league doesn't, with Kawhi Leonard not there, and so they're going to bring it. They've got a lot of interesting pieces. They got a lot of ball handling, a lot of shooting, a lot of hungry young players coming off the bench, and so. Yeah, I think they'll be ready to challenge anybody.
Yeah, that's another important consideration there. That the fact they've been in Orlando for so long, I would definitely see that as an advantage for them. Practice time is going to be at a premium now, as it always is during the season. Time to get reacclimated, time to get your legs back under you, your shooting touch back, going through your schemes. And I was reading a little bit earlier last week I think Nick Nurse was talking about this, but they were going through a lot of film. I mean, this is a team that is laser focused. They've been to a championship. They know what to do on the court, how to approach this situation. So they've been running through sets. They've been going through this for weeks now. I think through different video calls, and they're very locked in. So I'm afraid for anybody in the Eastern Conference that has to go up against them because they're going to be a tough out. So before I let you go, Ian, one more team on this list, Denver, plus 3.3 strength of schedule. Another team that has had some ups and downs this season. Don't really know what to expect from them from night to night. At one point they could be an elite offense, and then their defense comes in. One of those teams that I just don't know what to expect really from them, especially in a season like this. So for their schedule, I mean, it looks pretty interesting. Miami as well, OKC, San Antonio, Portland, Utah, the Lakers, the Clippers back to back. That's very interesting. And then the Raptors, the aforementioned Raptors, to finish up the action. So for you, do you have any particular takeaways from this schedule, or is it kind of like everybody else, like just wait and see? I mean, this team, especially by the nature, is just all over the place, especially with a guy like Jamal Murray. I mean, I don't know if he's dropping 35 or dropping 10. I mean, just depends on the night.
Yeah, I don't think the schedule matters a ton to them. I think the big question is what kind of shape Nikola Jokic is in. I mean, there was the whole thing about how much weight he had dropped over over the quarantine, and theoretically, he was in the best shape of his life. But it also changes his play style. If he doesn't have that bulk, he's used to using his body in a certain way, and his body has changed. And then the positive COVID test, and obviously he won't be on the court if he's not recovered and tested negative for the virus. But we really don't know what the ramifications are for professional athletes in terms of recovery and their ability to we don't know what it'll take for him to sort of get back into game shape, get his lungs back, get his legs back. It might be might be nothing, or it might be a huge deal. And if they don't have Jokic, there's nothing else there that's should really scare anybody else in the West.
Yeah, that's true. One last question for you. With the issue of his weight and how much he's dropped over the past several weeks, with his play style, you kind of mentioned that he used that bulk a lot previously. Do you think that's going to be a detriment to him? I know some people are kind of split on this. Some people think that just being lighter on his feet, maybe having more stamina, is going to do wonders for him. But other people think that he's not going to be able to kind of bang and do his thing in the post as much. So you think that's going to be beneficial for him? I know we haven't seen him on the court yet, but how do you feel about that weight drop? Could it work against him in some way?
I think it's more about just not having time to adjust to it. In a vacuum, I think the weight loss is good. I think in the short term, it's just harder to come back and just not have had the reps with that body, and just not know how it works and what it does and what you can and can't do. And so, that would be my bigger concern. Other than the COVID stuff, just in terms of the weight loss, is him being able to have the reps with that body to just sort of get comfortable with it.
Definitely. That's important to consider. Guys that drop weight and gain weight, it's all about what's optimal for you. Some players function better at a heavier weight. Some people need to be lighter. It's just kind of how their bodies are designed. So, Ian, I want to thank you again for taking the time to join this podcast. Your insight, your knowledge of the game is highly appreciated, and great to be able to talk with you a little bit and just kind of see how you approach the game. Before you go, why don't you let the listeners know, or people that are viewing this podcast potentially, where they can find you on Twitter, and exactly what kind of work you got going on right now at the stepback/nylon/fansided.
I mean, we're trying to make the most of prepping for the playoffs, just like everybody else out there. Hoping we get some games soon to dissect. But you can find me on Twitter at Hickory High, and all of our stuff is fansided.com/NBA. Awesome,
Ian. Well, guys, definitely make sure to check him out. A lot of great content over on that site for your just viewing pleasure. And it's been a great podcast, and I hope that you guys have enjoyed it as well. For Business Casual Basketball, be sure to follow us over on Twitter and Instagram. That's going to be BC Basketball 2. And then, of course, our website is linked to this podcast wherever you might be watching it. So be sure to check out our website for more blog posts and information on this NBA season. So thanks again, everybody, for taking the time to join us. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And then we'll be back dissecting this NBA and the restart here before you know it. And